May 10th, 1940. The morning fog lay thick over the rolling fields of northern France, clinging to the edges of the dense Ardennes forest like a shroud. French soldiers, confident and slightly amused, lined the trenches and observation posts, their eyes scanning the horizon for what they assumed would be an ordinary maneuver by the German army. Across Europe, France had long been regarded as a military powerhouse. Its army, seasoned and disciplined, had survived the trench horrors of the Great War and fortified its nation with what it considered an impregnable defense: the Maginot Line. Behind those concrete walls, French generals and officers whispered about the limitations of German armor, claiming that even if Berlin sent its tanks across the border, they would be no match for French ingenuity or firepower. And yet, as dawn broke, the first columns of Panzer tanks appeared not over the open plains, but through the seemingly impenetrable Ardennes. French troops, peering through their binoculars, laughed. These machines, the Panzer I and II, looked almost laughably small. To them, thin armor, light cannons, barely enough to be called tanks. "Those aren't tanks," an officer reportedly joked. "They're toys. A parade for children." Flags waved. Rifles were cleaned leisurely, and soldiers even smoked cigarettes, secure in the belief that the German army had underestimated the treacherous forest and the fortifications ahead. No one among them suspected that these toys were moving with precision, coordination, and speed that would soon render every preconception meaningless. In less than 24 hours, the laughter would turn to panic, the mockery to disbelief, and the carefully mapped defenses into chaotic corridors of retreat. These German tanks weren't just vehicles. They were the spearhead of a revolution in warfare, a tactical symphony of steel and motion that would sweep through France faster than any artillery barrage, leaving confusion and collapse in its wake. The question that would haunt French commanders for decades was simple: how could something so seemingly insignificant dismantle the pride and power of an army that believed itself untouchable? The story of France's downfall in 1940 begins long before the first Panzer appeared at the edge of the Ardennes. By the late 1932, France was a nation armored with confidence, both literal and figurative. After the devastation of World War I, French military planners poured resources into defensive fortifications, creating what would become the legendary Maginot Line, a network of bunkers, artillery, and obstacles stretching hundreds of miles along the eastern frontier. The thinking was simple: France would hold, Germany would fail, and victory would remain secure behind concrete walls. Meanwhile, Germany was quietly preparing a very different type of war. Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht, still recovering from post-World War I restrictions, focused not on static defenses, but on mobility, coordination, and technological innovation. Tanks, aircraft, radios, and combined arms tactics became the backbone of a doctrine that would later be called Blitzkrieg. By 1940, German engineers had refined their Panzer designs into a series of light, medium, and heavy tanks, each optimized not for duels against fortified positions, but for speed, communication, and the ability to exploit weak points in enemy lines. French intelligence did note these developments, but they dismissed them. Reports described German tanks as light, slow, and unsophisticated, unlikely to breach prepared defenses. French generals and officers, comfortable in the hierarchy of their army, interpreted these vehicles through the lens of conventional warfare, where numerical superiority and defensive positions dictated outcomes. In their minds, the Panzer was nothing more than a curiosity, a machine that could never threaten the might of France's frontline divisions, with their larger caliber guns, thicker armor, and disciplined ranks. What the French failed to understand was that Germany had not built a collection of individual weapons, they had constructed a networked war machine. Panzer divisions were not intended to fight as isolated units. They were nodes in a coordinated assault system that included artillery, infantry, and the Luftwaffe. Radios, installed in every Panzer, allowed commanders to issue real-time orders across miles of forest, hills, and plains coordination that the French army could not hope to match. In short, France had prepared for the last war, while Germany had designed the tools for the next one. By the time the Ardennes became the stage for the German invasion, the French army had all the right pieces on the board, but they were playing the wrong game. Tanks were slow and heavy, command structures rigid, and communication often dependent on runners or visual signals. Across the border, the Germans moved differently, fast, coordinated, and unpredictably. This fundamental misjudgment would prove catastrophic. And when the first Panzer columns emerged from the forest, the French were not merely surprised, they were unprepared to comprehend the scale, speed, and coordination of what was coming. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. An army that laughed at its enemy would soon discover that the enemy's laughter had been replaced by a deadly, precise, and unstoppable advance. By mid-morning on May 10th, 1940, the first Panzer columns had moved well beyond what French reconnaissance considered possible. The French, perched in their foxholes and observation posts, still assumed the tanks would slog slowly through the dense Ardennes. They did not. The Panzers, light and deceptively nimble, navigated narrow forest paths and steep inclines with a mechanical grace that seemed almost unnatural, unlike the cumbersome French Char B1s, which relied on heavy armor and brute force. The Panzer IIs and IIs darted through the terrain, their engines humming in precise synchronization. The true shock, however, came not from the speed alone, but from coordination. Every Panzer was equipped with radio equipment, a marvel that allowed division commanders to orchestrate attacks over miles of forested terrain. French officers, accustomed to visual signals or runners, could not fathom the extent of this communication. As one French report later admitted, "Our troops had no idea where the enemy tanks were, or how many we faced. They seemed everywhere and nowhere at once." In essence, these toy tanks were nodes in a living network, capable of reacting instantly to changing battlefield conditions. French gunners found themselves aiming at shadows. A tank would appear, fire a shot, and vanish, only to re-emerge on a different flank minutes later. Attempts to counterattack were hampered by miscommunication. Commands filtered down the French line slowly, often arriving too late to be effective. Meanwhile, German tank crews, trained rigorously in these tactics, operated with a confidence born of repetition. Each unit understood its role, each movement part of a larger, choreographed assault that made the French defenses seem like paper. By noon, the consequences became undeniable. Entire French units, previously stationed to guard the roads and forest paths, were outmaneuvered. Tanks that had been dismissed as fragile now encircled strongpoints with terrifying precision. Radio coordination allowed the Panzers to call in infantry support, artillery strikes, and air cover almost instantaneously. The French had planned for a slow, methodical advance by the Germans. Instead, they faced a storm of mechanized warfare moving at a pace their doctrine could not match. The first major engagement occurred near the town of Sedan, a crucial junction in the French defensive network. Here, French troops believed the Ardennes would act as a natural barrier, and their tanks, heavier, more armored, and individually more powerful, would dominate any light German vehicles attempting to advance. What unfolded, however, was a textbook demonstration of blitzkrieg. German panzers struck in coordinated waves. Light tanks screened forward positions, medium tanks delivered firepower where needed, and motorized infantry followed, securing every objective the panzers bypassed. French artillery, trained to fire on fixed or predictable targets, struggled to track the mobile units. Within hours, French commanders realized their defenses were fragmented. Units that had been expected to hold roads and bridges found themselves isolated, unable to communicate, and surrounded on multiple sides. Reports from French officers later painted a grim picture. Machine gunners firing into empty fields, tanks advancing only to find enemy armor already behind them, and infantry units retreating in confusion. The laughter that greeted the panzers that morning had long vanished, replaced by disbelief and fear. Orders to regroup often collided with reality, as the mobility and communication of the German units made traditional French command methods ineffective. By evening, entire French divisions had begun a chaotic retreat. Roads clogged with abandoned vehicles, artillery pieces, and panicked soldiers. The once formidable line now resembled a broken cord. German reports noted their tanks had crossed the Meuse River with minimal resistance, while French troops scrambled to mount any effective counter. The Panzer, once a subject of ridicule, had proven its lethality not through sheer firepower, but through speed, coordination, and the exploitation of an enemy unwilling or unable to adapt. This initial collapse marked the beginning of a campaign that would unravel France in weeks. The French army had underestimated the toy tanks, dismissing their tactical innovations and communication capabilities. What followed would be a lesson in how mobility, coordination, and doctrinal foresight could outmatch even the heaviest armor and largest guns when the battlefield was understood and exploited differently. By May 12th, the situation for the French had deteriorated further. The German panzer divisions, having pierced the Ardennes, now faced the critical obstacle of the Meuse River, a natural defensive line the French had believed impassable for tanks in significant numbers. Yet, the panzers approached with their characteristic speed and coordination. Every commander, aware of their role, every tank in constant communication with the others. Reconnaissance units scouted the riverbanks, identifying weak points and bridges that could be seized or improvised crossings constructed. The French, expecting a slow advance, had positioned artillery to cover a narrow front, leaving wide stretches of the river virtually unprotected. German engineers, riding in tandem with the armor, deployed portable bridges with astonishing efficiency, while light tanks provided covering fire and monitored French movements. Within hours, panzer units were across the river, consolidating positions on the far bank before French units could even organize a coherent defense. The French High Command struggled to respond. Orders trickled down, often arriving too late or contradicted by chaotic reports from the front. Tanks meant to form defensive lines found themselves isolated, surrounded by German armor that could strike from multiple directions. French morale faltered as retreating units spread confusion, inadvertently creating gaps that the panzers exploited. By the afternoon, the Germans controlled key roads and towns along the Meuse, opening a corridor for further mechanized advance into France's heartland. Radio communication, still a novelty for the French tank units, allowed German commanders to adjust rapidly to changing conditions. Every movement of a French detachment was relayed, countered, and often anticipated. What had been dismissed as a minor maneuver, a handful of light tanks now dictated the tempo of the entire campaign. The myth of French tank superiority crumbled in these first days of the campaign. The Char B1 and Renault R35 were formidable machines on paper. Thick armor, powerful guns, and heavy chassis designed to withstand frontal assaults. Yet in practice, they were slow, unwieldy, and poorly coordinated. Without radios, French crews relied on visual signals and runners, methods disastrously inadequate against a foe whose every tank could communicate instantly. Engagements became exercises in frustration for the French. A Char B1 might engage a Panzer III and score a hit, only to find another Panzer flanking it from an angle that could not have been anticipated without real-time coordination. Infantry support, crucial for protecting tanks from close-range attacks, often lagged behind or became lost in the confusion of retreating columns. The French army, built for methodical, deliberate operations, faced a mobile adversary who dictated both tempo and battlefield geometry. Witness accounts from French officers describe the disorienting nature of these encounters. They appeared from every direction, one noted, and yet never seemed to collide with one another. It was as if they shared a single mind, moving and striking with precision we could not hope to match. These observations highlighted a critical lesson. Tank warfare was no longer about individual machine superiority, but about integration, communication, and speed. By May 14th, French armor was increasingly relegated to reactive roles. Attempts to counterattack often failed before they began. Neutralized by coordinated panzer movements and rapid concentration of fire, the French had underestimated not just the panzers themselves, but the doctrinal revolution behind them, the combination of mobility, radios, and combined arms tactics that would define modern mechanized warfare. By May 15th, the focus of the German advance shifted towards Sedan, a key strategic town perched along the Meuse. French command had reinforced the area, believing its natural river defenses and artillery placements sufficient to halt the panzers. Yet, the German assault unfolded with a precision that seemed almost preordained. Panzer divisions, supported by Luftwaffe dive bombers, approached under the cover of morning mist. Reconnaissance vehicles reported gaps in French lines, while engineers prepared bridges and pontoons to cross the Meuse at unexpected points. Within hours, the panzers had penetrated the French defenses, exploiting both terrain and French indecision. French troops scrambled to react, but their movements were piecemeal and disorganized. Orders issued from headquarters arrived hours late or were misinterpreted, leaving units isolated and vulnerable. French tank crews, despite the impressive armor of the Char B-1, were forced into frontal engagements against coordinated German formations, exposing weaknesses in mobility and fire coordination. Witnesses later recounted the chaos. "We had guns and armor, but we were blind. They struck, vanished, and reappeared elsewhere. It was not our tanks that failed, it was our inability to fight as one." By nightfall, Sedan had fallen, opening a corridor for German forces to pour into northern France, bypassing the heavily fortified Maginot Line entirely. The fall of Sedan had a cascading effect on French morale. Units retreating from the Meuse corridor spread panic along secondary lines, leaving towns and positions abandoned without a fight. Soldiers and officers alike struggled to comprehend the speed and coordination of the German advance, a pace that defied conventional military logic. French command attempted counterattacks, but the lack of radio communication among units rendered coordination nearly impossible. Tanks that could have struck from the flanks instead engaged head-on, while infantry, isolated and cut off, fell prey to mechanized pincer movements. Even artillery, designed to dominate static defenses, was rendered ineffective as German units continuously repositioned and struck with combined arms precision. By May 17th, the French army was in full retreat. The myth of invincibility surrounding their armored forces was shattered. In the span of just a few days, the panzers had achieved what French strategists had deemed impossible: rapid penetration, sustained mobility, and decisive engagement, all orchestrated through superior communication and doctrine. The psychological impact was profound. French soldiers, trained to rely on pre-planned maneuvers and heavy armor, found themselves fighting isolated skirmishes rather than coordinated battles. The Germans, by contrast, advanced as cohesive units, each panzer aware of its position within the larger operational plan, exploiting both French weaknesses and their own tactical advantages. By May 20th, German panzer divisions had pierced deep into northern France, racing past towns and bypassing fortified positions as if they didn't exist. French forces attempted to regroup, but their lines were fragmented beyond recognition. Roads were clogged with retreating infantry and abandoned equipment, creating chaos that slowed any organized resistance. German coordination, honed through years of mechanized doctrine and radio communication, allowed panzers to exploit every weakness. Tanks reported enemy positions in real time. Artillery strikes were called in within minutes, and infantry units advanced in perfect support formations. The French, despite having technically superior tanks like the Char B-1 and Somme S-35, were unable to concentrate their firepower effectively. One after another, French strongpoints fell, not to superior firepower, but to speed, mobility, and cohesion. By May 24th, German units had reached the outskirts of the Seine, effectively splitting the French army in two. Cities that had been considered safe behind defensive lines were now exposed, surrendering without a fight. The psychological shock on French commanders was palpable. In reports later filed, officers admitted, "We had underestimated their machines, but more so, we underestimated their ability to fight together as one." It was not the Panzer's armor or gun that won the day. It was the networked force, moving with relentless precision. The collapse of French defenses in 1940 marked a turning point in modern warfare. For the first time in European history, mechanized warfare demonstrated that coordination, mobility, and communication could defeat even the most heavily fortified positions. The lesson was clear. A tank alone, no matter how powerful, is nothing without integration into a larger, flexible force. French planners, who had laughed at the primitive panzers just weeks earlier, were forced to confront a bitter reality. Superior armor and firepower cannot compensate for fragmented command and poor communication. Meanwhile, the German Wehrmacht, with its doctrine of combined arms and emphasis on radio communication, had validated every principle of blitzkrieg. The consequences extended far beyond France. Military theorists worldwide would study the 1940 campaign, noting how a comparatively small force, properly coordinated and fully mechanized, could achieve strategic results far beyond its size. The fall of France would shape the next 5 years of the war, influencing everything from armored doctrine to industrial mobilization. Ultimately, the story of the Panzers in 1940 was not just about tanks crushing defenses. It was a story of information, speed, and the ruthless efficiency of coordinated mechanized warfare. The French army's laughter became a symbol of complacency, and the Panzer's unstoppable advance became a warning to all who would underestimate the power of a force that fights as a single, unified organism.